A common perception might be a 1.5-hour video about Irish gangs. What for? Well, there were a couple of movies about them. The topic pops up in TV series. What else is there? They're not the Italians, not the Latin American cartels, and not even the organized crime groups of the 90s. What could possibly be discussed for a whole hour and a half? However, upon closer examination of the topic of Irish gangs, an interesting point emerges. In almost any movie featuring Irish people and crime, they are always in supporting roles. They faithfully serve the thugs from sunny Sicily, as Scorsese showed in The Irishman. They hang out somewhere in the background, like in the Cotton Club. They are shadows behind the backs of the Cosa Nostra, but nothing more. It turned out that this cinematic stereotype doesn't align with reality at all. Maybe Irish gangs were never as influential as Latin American cartels, but they kept America's top politicians on a leash. Rappers don't write about their crimes and subculture like they do about the gangs of Los Angeles. Nevertheless, they are constantly in league with various celebrities. Here, for example, is mixed martial arts star Conor McGregor hanging out with bigwigs from an Irish cartel. And here is boxer Tyson Fury making excuses, claiming he has no connection to the leader of this organized crime group, a man named Kinahan. For context, there is a $15 million reward for this criminal's head. Irish gangs were never famous for their brutality like the Salvadorans of MS-13, but despite this, they were hated, feared, and could not be broken for over 150 years. And what's most striking is that behind this monstrous criminal picture lies a tragedy. The tragedy of a small but very militant people, whose distorted and tormented historical memory has kept the criminal world shaking for 3 centuries. This is a complete anthology of Irish gangs. It will explore the reason why Ireland lost half of its population in 5 years, became the poorest, and then the richest country in Europe, surpassing Norway. Why did the Democratic Party of the USA sponsor the most dangerous organized crime groups in America? How did economic growth give rise to the most influential Irish gang of modern times? Where did Martin Scorsese get it wrong, and why is Conor McGregor actually so audacious? The main Irish thugs won't be forgotten either. It will be told how they made money from robbery, arms trafficking, and drug trafficking, and why they befriended politicians, intimidated athletes, and bribed cops. There will be hitmen with a code of honor, and madmen with a thirst for power, as is customary in historical series on the Mafia. Every year on July 4th, Americans celebrate Independence Day. They gather with their families for barbecues, set off fireworks, and have fun. The entire country, from Boston to Seattle, is festively noisy. But in 1857 in New York, this day became particularly loud, specifically in the 5 Points neighborhood. This is a district in the very heart of Manhattan. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge and the most famous Chinatown in the US are just a stone's throw away. But if one were there in the mid-19th century, they would have been struck not by pork dim sum or Peking duck, but by something else. Back then, the Points were the most crime-ridden place in the city. Dilapidation, thieves, and robbers who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty were everywhere. Crowds of migrants who had flooded the area added a special gloom. They survived in hellish conditions. Many withered from hunger and burned from cholera and consumption. A real hell on earth. For 5 Points, this was typical daily life. But the events of July 1857 horrified even the locals, who seemed to have gotten used to everything. If one had been in the area that day, they wouldn't have immediately understood what was happening. It seems like a normal late evening, when suddenly some commotion begins on the street. Vendors hurriedly close their shops, women scream at their children to run home quickly, and quietly whisper something about the Virgin Mary. Raised eyebrows and the question frozen in one's eyes, "Excuse me, what is happening here?" are answered by the sound of gunfire. The streets fill with some dreadful types. They are holding pikes with rabbit carcasses impaled on them. These animal abusers quickly find the butchers from the other camp. A brawl immediately breaks out, a wall-against-wall clash, with shooting everywhere, knives, stones, bricks, and even people thrown from the roofs of neighboring houses are flying around. Every hour, new fighters arrive, replacing those who have been left lying on the ground forever. And the main police force doesn't even try to intervene. One would probably have just one question: what the hell is going on here? Nothing special, just the largest armed gang conflict of the 19th century. In the right corner of the ring are enraged Irishmen with dead rabbit carcasses at the ready. Their gang is called just that, the Dead Rabbits. This is the same gang from Scorsese's legendary film, Gangs of New York. In the left corner of the ring is the Bowery Boys gang. Their leader is William, Bill the Butcher. The former are Irish migrants, and the latter are locals who hate the Irish with all their soul, if the New Yorkers of that era can even be characterized by the word locals. The terrible massacre lasted for 2 days. There were so many corpses and maimed bodies on the ground that the gangsters constantly tripped over the motionless bodies. On the first day, the New York police did absolutely nothing. On the second day, when journalists began to sound the alarm, the cops tried to take the situation under control, arresting everyone they could without distinction, but this did not help to stop the slaughter. And then Isaiah Reinders, a businessman, politician, and the most influential Irish criminal of those years, stepped onto the stage. The slaughter only ended after the New York City Hall intervened. Let me repeat, to restore peace to the city and stop the rampaging gangsters, the police asked for help from the biggest gangster of all. We were taught, of course, about a system of checks and balances and the separation of powers, but what we see here is not separation, but decomposition. It is important to understand here that Irish gangs could no longer be stopped by force alone. They had become a headache not only for New York but for all of America. Similar outbreaks of lawlessness involving the Irish occurred across the country. For example, in Muhammad Ali's hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, Irish people were burned alive right in their churches. In Baltimore, the Irish and their opponents slashed each other at the polls during elections. How could this happen? To begin, it's necessary to rewind and figure out how the Irish ended up in America in the first place. Why couldn't they just stay on their little green island? At first glance, the logic is sound. The Irish are not Jews or Gypsies, who have lived in diasporas all over and were forced to constantly relocate. The Irish are descendants of the Celts. Throughout history, this ancient people had their own land, protected on all sides by the sea, and some form of statehood. Ireland had its own clans, lords, and kingdoms, which, admittedly, were flimsy. This is an important detail for us. Therefore, when their prim neighbors, the English, began to rise, the fate of Ireland was sealed. Britain, or back then just the Kingdom of England, got its hands into Ireland as early as the 10th century. The colonization was started by the then King, Henry II. The English looked down on their neighbors. And it's understandable why. They were stronger, richer, and the Irish lands were much more fertile than those of the English. It would be a sin for such wealth to go to waste. Finally, the impudent island was situated right on Britain's western borders. Geography itself suggested, if you don't seize the land of the Celts in time, your sworn enemies, France or Spain, will. And if not today, then tomorrow, Ireland will become a staging ground for an invasion of England. Of this, there can be no doubt. Let's not forget about the cultural difference. One may know well what English sounds like. And this is Irish Gaelic. The native language of the Irish sounds soft, musical, like a mix of Danish and Dutch. Soon, the English would take control of the island. England began to form into an empire, and Ireland de facto became an English colony. It would retain this status for a long 8 centuries. At first, London controlled the island through earls, who were appointees of the English crown. Clan chiefs were forced to give them a vassal's oath. Then, the Irish began to be demeaned through a policy of ruin. The English seized land, destroyed Irish customs, imposed their Anglo-Norman system, and, of course, strictly monitored tax collection. In the 10th century, the Kilkenny Statute appeared. In effect, it was a ban on Irish culture, language, customs, traditional clothing, and even mixed marriages. Fortunately, no one strictly enforced the law, but the case is telling. Although the Irish had no chance against the English, they tried to fight. The most notable attempt was the Rebellion of 1798. A year before Pushkin's birth, the Irish were inspired by the example of the Great French Revolution and even asked France for support in the form of personnel. However, they failed to transfer enough troops, so the Irish had to advance on their own, relying on morale. They won a couple of battles, but it was all in vain. A couple of months later, the English brutally suppressed the rebellion. In the end, 2,000 crown soldiers and tens of thousands of rebels died. To consolidate their success, the English carried out mass repressions, hanging and shooting rebels, burning houses, and killing women and children. There were many such unsuccessful uprisings in Ireland. If one looks at them from the outside, a common problem immediately becomes apparent. The descendants of the Celts don't know how to negotiate with each other. They are constantly hindered by old grievances and squabbles, and even a formidable common enemy cannot unite the disparate clans. As a result, by the 15th century, the Irish had effectively become a people who had a country but no homeland. So, you're Irish and you want to live where you were born and where your ancestors' graves are. Be so kind as to rent a plot of land from an English landlord. He lives somewhere in Yorkshire. He has never been to Ireland, but the land you and all your neighbors live on is his, on paper. Want to send a package to your grandmother in the next province? Learn the new English street names. You can basically forget your native language. Want to trade? Go ahead, but only at the prices and volumes that are profitable for the English gentleman. London artificially configured Ireland's economy in its own interests. They restricted trade with other countries and allowed them to engage only in agriculture. What's more, the English didn't even consider them equals. To them, the Irish were barbarians. Here is an example of such racism from 1899, where the Irish are depicted as descendants of black people. The Anglo-Teutons, with their Roman profiles, high foreheads, and piercing gazes, are another matter entirely. As a result, Ireland turned into an agricultural appendage of its eastern neighbor. But even this was not enough for the English. The grain laws of the first half of the 19th century drove down the selling price of almost all crops grown by the Irish. For example, one sheaf of grain, which is tens of kilos, could be sold for no more than 20 shillings each. In those days, you couldn't even buy a sheep for that much money, and trading with anyone else was forbidden. To simply survive, they had to grow the recently introduced potato. It took well to the rocky terrain, and there was no point in trading it. It was too cheap a product. The volumes needed for trade were gigantic. 2/3 of Irish households at that time subsisted on potatoes alone. They must have been tired of potato jokes too. This love for the potato would later play its tragic role in the history of Ireland. Before returning to the butchers and thugs, it is necessary to talk about spiritual food. There were problems with that as well. At that time, England was intensively cultivating its own version of Protestantism, Anglicanism. The Vatican did not want to lose its influence over the English, which it had always had. In the end, Rome pitted France and Spain against England and arranged various conspiracies. They failed to bring England back to Catholicism. Quite the opposite. The English came to hate Catholics, and the Irish, to their misfortune, were mostly Catholics. The Irish were never considered first-class citizens anyway. Perhaps there was discrimination against red-haired people with freckles, but with the church conflict, they were no longer treated as human beings at all. Punitive laws were introduced. The Irish were forbidden to own livestock, tools, or land. Basic things like civil service and education were also out of the question. And, of course, a ban on religious practice, an almost slavish position. But in the 19th century, things got even worse. Then, something happened that devout Irish people considered the beginning of the apocalypse. One can understand them. The horsemen of war had already galloped through their lands, and then came the crop failure. Moreover, 1 year of crop failure followed another. The potato, which fed almost the entire country, was destroyed by late blight. This is a fungal disease of plants from which one can now be saved by a fertilizer costing 400 rubles. But back then, this ailment triggered the most terrible famine in the history of the entire island. At some point, Great Britain came to its senses and tried to help its vassals, well, at least to survive. But, frankly, it wasn't very successful. The real catastrophe began when John Russell, a conservative and the grandfather of the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, took the helm of economic reforms. The grandson is remembered in history for defending the ideals of pacifism. The grandfather also believed in high ideals, those of the market. This is how he decided, the Irish no longer need any state support. The invisible hand of the market and philanthropists will help the starving. As it turned out, behind this decision was not a belief in Adam Smith, but the conviction that it was God's way of punishing the heretics. Well, why then go against the will of the Almighty, who had taken a dislike to the Catholics? We will not go there. We don't need to go there. The consequences of this decision were horrific. In 5 years, about 1 million people died from starvation and epidemics. This is almost every 8th inhabitant of Ireland. The consequences of the Great Famine, as it came to be known in the country's history, still haunt Ireland today. A recent study showed that a person's willingness to become a revolutionary during Ireland's fight for independence increased depending on how severely the Great Famine had affected their region. The more people who had died there, the higher the probability that you would get a rebel. Football fans still use the Great Famine to insult the Irish when they play against them at the national level. Here, for example, is a banner from the Italy-Ireland match. The famine is over. Go home, King potato eaters. In addition to a cultural wound, the Great Famine left a demographic trauma. And it's not just about mortality. The Irish decided that the horseman of the apocalypse was showing them the door. Amid the famine, more than 2 million people left the country. Together with the million who died, the country lost almost half of its citizens. Most of those who survived fled to the USA. What would await a person on this journey if they were an Irishman or Irishwoman who decided to cross the ocean in the mid-19th century for salvation and some kind of future? Well, to begin with, there are a lot of people like them, which cannot be said for the ships that can take them across the Atlantic. Secondly, a one-way ticket would be very, very expensive. And one must not forget that they would have to transport their whole family. So the price tag is staggering. Thirdly, they would not be traveling in the economy class of a comfortable airplane, but on a very specific type of ship. A vessel of this type was nicknamed a coffin ship. Tiny cabins were packed like cans of Sprats in tomato sauce, with almost no access to light. In such conditions, you couldn't take much food with you. Access to clean water was not guaranteed either. One can forget about hygiene, toilets, and personal space. And this is a big problem, because thousands of people are crammed into this coffin, hundreds of whom are already sick with cholera or typhus. Complaints about the rocking and seasickness should be saved for tourist cruises. And the finishing touch, one would have to spend, get ready for it, from 40 to 60 days in this hellish coffin. Towards the end of the trip, however, it would get a bit more spacious. On average, out of 10 brave souls who boarded this coffin in Ireland, at best, 7 would reach American shores, at worst, 5. It all depended on how much the captain cared about the passengers and how quickly those who didn't survive the journey were thrown overboard. One would know about all the pleasures of the sea voyage in advance, but staying in one's homeland seemed even worse. The image of America in the 19th century was inspiring. It was something else. They had just thrown off the yoke of their enemies, the hated English. The country of the future, where railways, shipbuilding, and new technologies like the telegraph were developing. A place where everyone could earn a decent living through their own hard work. But when the Irish were lucky enough to reach America, they looked around and realized they had fallen into some kind of bad dream. To talk again about the antics of the red-haired thugs who love ale, consider the MacDonald family. Here are typical Irish refugees of the mid-19th century. The head of the family is a shoemaker, the mother a housewife who can't read or write. She has 3 rascals on her hands. These characters left the shores of their native Ireland even before the Great Famine began, in anticipation of a new, decent life in America. Reality poured a bucket of ice-cold water on their heads. It quickly turned out that being Irish in free America was not much better than in ruthless Britain, from which they had fled. Prejudice against migrants was everywhere, from the labor and housing markets to the attitudes of journalists. Look at this ad in the New York Times from 1854. No Irish need apply. Essentially, Irish not wanted, or, for non-Irish only. This phrase could be found on shop signs and in any newspaper with job advertisements. How is this possible? It's the 19th century, where racism is considered a conventional worldview, but the Irish have light skin, speak English, and have a European culture. Why the hate? The thing is, at that time in the USA, only WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were considered truly white. There is a popular video game, BioShock Infinite. The action takes place in an imaginary American town called Columbia, which floats in the sky. Strict Puritans live there, believing in the Holy Founding Fathers, the chosenness of the American people, and the holy dollar. It's a rather colorful satire on those very WASPs. At the bottom of BioShock's society are Asians, black people, and the Irish. This is no accident. Chauvinism towards the Irish originated back in the Middle Ages, thanks to Pope Adrian IV. His mother was English, so without a second thought, he established that all Irish, Scots, and Welsh were barbarians. Revenge, the ordinary, base revenge of one high-ranking person, became the rule for centuries. As soon as the McDonalds arrived in the New World, they came to a sad realization. The rules here are pretty much the same as in their homeland. Gentlemen in expensive suits discuss them behind their backs, saying something about innate stupidity, a love for alcohol, and idleness. The local mothers are no better. They teach their sons and daughters to stay away from the younger McDonalds because they supposedly spread diseases and teach bad things. The McDonalds were often called N-words turned inside out, and local African Americans were called smoked Irish. In such conditions, it's not just hard to find a job, it's unclear how to live at all. As a bonus, the McDonald family did not arrive in America alone. Millions of other Irish brought with them diseases and sorrow, from which they drank without sobering up. In short, the practice of alcoholism only reinforced the stereotypes. But that was only half the trouble. The labor market was shaken by the influx of migrants. The Irish were willing to work for pennies. They toiled for 12, or even 16 hours a day. Women received $4 a month for domestic work. This was exactly the cost of renting a tiny room on the outskirts of the city. Men in factories earned a bit more, up to 75 cents per shift. And that was if they were lucky. It seemed to Americans that the Irish had taken over all possible jobs. Let's take a hypothetical John Smith, a Protestant, a third-generation American. And one fine day, his boss at the factory comes up to him and says that from now on, you, Smith, will be paid 1.5 times less and work twice as much. Don't like it? Get out. There's a whole queue of Mikes and Patties for your spot. These were stereotypical Irish names in those years. Smith was unlucky. His employer is not an old-fashioned chauvinist, so he values profit more than ideological principles. And so this native New Yorker gathers with his friends in a bar to curse these newly arrived Irish. One glass, then another. And soon, a crowd of angry workers is heading to the neighborhood where our Mikes and Patties live. A pogrom begins. Unfortunately for the McDonalds, they see everything that happens with their own eyes. These rioters would be called nativists, from the English word native. They hated the Irish because they were migrants, because they were taking their jobs. And, of course, they hated them for their faith. WASP Protestants considered Catholics an existential threat to America. They demonized Catholic priests. They saw pagan motifs in church rites, and promiscuity and licentiousness in Irish traditions. What kind of normal Christian would drink on a holiday? What are these explicit dances? Such debauchery. In cities with Irish diasporas, nativists carried out raids on Catholic neighborhoods. They smashed homes and shops, set fire to churches, and could even kill the infidels, as they called them. Legends say that once, nativists were so fierce during another anti-Irish pogrom that they almost burned down all of Philadelphia. Remember the Bowery Boys from the beginning of the video? The ones who fought with the Irish in the center of New York. The members of this gang were precisely from the WASP community, who hated the Irish and all Catholics along with them. They saw themselves as almost sanitizers, ridding their native land of the contagion that had reached them from across the ocean. Now, try once more to imagine oneself as an Irish migrant. One has endured sorrow in their native land, which neither they nor their children owned and never will. One miraculously survived the horrors of the Great Famine, having buried a dozen neighbors, friends, and relatives. One went through hellish torment on a coffin ship, escaping to a new world that was dreamed of as a haven of peace and prosperity. And in the end, one lives in poverty, discrimination, and violence from the very same Protestants one fled from, though these Protestants are now in a new guise. Some continued to endure. The McDonalds would do just that. But there were people of a different sort. A guy named James lost his arm in a factory accident and couldn't stand the atmosphere of New York. The Irish community didn't care about him either, but he didn't give up and went to seek his fortune in other states. Remember this one-armed man. He is an important character in this story, but many were not going to either run or surrender. The Irish quickly realized that the best defense is a good offense. The 5 Points of New York became the base for the Celtic Avengers. 5 Points became not only a home for thousands of Irish but also a battlefield against the nativists. Almost every day, someone was killed there. There is a common legend that in just one building, the Old Brewery, there was at least one murder per day. This was a typical tenement house with cheap apartments where Irish workers were packed by the dozens. Gradually, the area was populated by other migrants, like the Italians, who also became imbued with the spirit of the Irish rebels. For example, they saw how Paul Kelly, the founder of the famous 5 Points Gang, one of the most prominent gangs in America 150 years ago, operated. Paul got into the gangster scene through illegal fighting, proved himself to be an excellent boxer, and went into racketeering. Soon, Irish gangs began to provide protection for the businesses of their ordinary, peace-loving neighbors, their own Irish neighbors. Before our very eyes, the once defenders of their people were themselves turning into bloodthirsty feudal lords. They continued to wage war against the rioters and rival gangsters. But there was no longer any question of diaspora unity. Usually, the Irish could not respond in any way. To go to the police meant snitching on your own people. This was the most shameful sin. The community would not accept you after that. And it's unlikely the cops would want to deal with the affairs of social outcasts. It was easier for them to turn a blind eye. The more Irish gangsters, the fewer Irish gangsters. The only way out for an Irishman whose fellow countrymen destroyed his business, beat his father, and took his sisters into sexual slavery was to form his own gang and take revenge. Not on the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, but on his own brothers in misfortune. What kind of social drama in the style of Maxim Gorky is this? Why, despite a dangerous common enemy, did the Irish not hesitate to whack each other? The answer lies on the colorful streets of New York in 1870. On July 12th, a traditional Irish parade is organized here. People celebrate, congratulate passers-by, dance to national music, and suddenly, the cheerful procession is attacked. Bottles and bricks rain down from the windows of houses, shooting and chaos begin. Crowds beat and slash each other. The scene is filled with blood and corpses. And no, this is not another action by nativists against migrants. Not gangsters, not religious fanatics. Ordinary Irish people began to slaughter other Irish people. The main schism once again turned out to be religious. But from where? Weren't all Irish Catholic? Not exactly. In fact, in those years, there were already plenty of Protestants among the migrants. The Irish had been leaving for the States even before the potato famine. Many of them had changed their denomination due to English laws that, for example, forbade passing on inheritance to non-Protestants. Others changed their denomination already in the States. In short, by the time their Catholic brethren arrived, they had managed to settle in somehow, and then waves of hungry, poor, and sick countrymen came flooding in. The incomes of the Celtic Protestants began to fall sharply. Therefore, Irish Protestants looked at Irish Catholics like relatives whose arrival you didn't expect, who annoy you from the first minute, and you count the days until they get the hell out. They were furious that because of these newcomers, they were being compared to uncultured migrants. Some Irish began to join the Protestant movement in favor of British rule over Ireland. Their hearts no longer ached for their homeland, and the Protestant faith suited them just fine. Catholic gangs did not tolerate this attitude for long. From 1870, the Irish across America began to stage the so-called Orange Riots. Irish Catholics attacked Irish Protestants wherever they could reach them. The incident at the Irish Parade is from the same series. It must be emphasized here that this fragmentation is part of the Irish nature. The Celts, well, their descendants, were never a monolith that stood up against a common enemy. In reality, the Irish clans much preferred to fight with each other. The basic philosophy of these gangs is family above community. We'll help you, of course, but if push comes to shove, you'd better find a way to swim on your own. I have my own family to feed. For comparison, remember the initiation rite in the Italian Mafia. Are you ready to kill a brother from your old family for the sake of the new family? An Italian is ready to do anything for the Mafia. Michael Corleone, who killed his own brother, would not lie. Hence the specifics of Irish gangs. They are all small, they squabble with other groups, and they rarely unite. They did not have a rigid hierarchy like the Italians or the Mexicans in the cartels. Moreover, throughout their criminal history, the Irish worked as outsourced mercenaries. Believe me, the Thieves' Guild is no match for their level of professionalism and craziness. Before you is a price list of services from the Wyos, a gang that held all of New York in terror 140 years ago. For a good punch, an Irishman would get 10 cups of coffee or 3 to 4 glasses of cheap whiskey at a bar. One knockout could cover a month's rent for a modest two-room apartment in Manhattan. A big job would cover the cost of 2 revolvers, ammunition, and a good suit. A gentleman's kit in exchange for a human life taken. The main problem with this business model is that finding freelance orders, especially in a highly competitive environment, is a major headache. Therefore, gangs had to settle with regular clients. Frank Sheeran, whose story was the basis for Scorsese's film The Irishman, chose just such a career. His employer was the Italian Bufalino family. But this is more of a modern story. The Irish of the 19th century had no connections with the Italians, especially with the Sicilians, because there were not that many of them in the US at the time. However, they still found their main client. It was the Democratic Party of the USA. Don't be surprised, under its wing worked the organization Tammany Hall, which in the 19th century became the most powerful political machine, as they were then called, in the city of New York. It was an informal structure through which the party controlled votes and appointments using nepotism, bribery, and personal connections, rather than through transparent procedures. In those years, the Democrats realized that the crowds of Irish could be turned to their advantage. What did they want? To get a passport and assimilate, and the Democrats needed votes in the elections. Therefore, Tammany Hall began to actively help the Irish diaspora. Migrants received dry rations and got jobs in municipal services, and in return, the Democrats helped them with their documents, and after a couple of years, they became U.S. citizens. The Irish did not remain in debt and always responsibly voted for the party of the donkeys in elections. The electoral effect was colossal. By 1850, every 4th resident of New York was Irish. It sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory, but such political machines, as Tammany Hall was called, are a completely real story. The rise in crime became another window of opportunity for this organization. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, politics in New York was unimaginable without brave lads with clubs at the ready. Almost all the gangs we've talked about before served the interests of this party offshoot. Moreover, the gangsters regularly carried out raids against the competitors of these party members. Those were no fools and hired their own attack dogs. The Bowery Boys and other gangsters with whom the Irish regularly clashed were precisely the mercenaries of the nativist party. For their work, the gangs received money and almost complete immunity. Tammany Hall, for example, had the police completely under its thumb, so they did not interfere in Irish affairs. Irish gangs were a convenient tool for activists to solve problems, a tool they could discard at any moment. At least, that's what they thought. The slaughter with which we began our episode shuffled all the cards. What looked like chaos to the common person was, for politicians, a repositioning of pieces on the chessboard of New York. Irish gangs did not waste time. They skillfully used the protection they received from the Democrats. They accumulated their initial capital through racketeering and underground clubs and decided they were now strong enough to compete on equal terms with their elders. In short, since the 40s, a whole generation of people had grown up whose homeland was not Ireland, but those very slums with their harsh laws and gangs. 5 points raised real hungry wolves who knew, either you eat, or you will be eaten. This is how the residents of New York remembered the Wyos gang with their intricate price list. In their free time, they hung out in bars and clubs run by the main figures of the group. The names of the establishments speak for themselves: the Morgue, Hellcat Maggie's. The bar owners boasted that their booze was universal, it would help you get drunk quickly and, if necessary, would be suitable for embalming a body. You know, there's a grain of truth in every joke. In the Morgue alone, about 100 murders occurred. If you think this was the work of nativists, it was the Irish, in a state of considerable intoxication, whacking each other. The Irish gangs couldn't see the forest for the trees. By the end of the 19th century, they no longer needed to fight against the nativists. New York, as you remember, was already a quarter Irish city, but despite this, they continued to squabble over trifles. The Irish began to lose New York. But in those same years, further west, amidst smoke, blood, and iron, their people were laying the first stone in the foundation of a real empire. Remember the MacDonald family we talked about? It has a specific historical prototype. The family of Michael Cassius MacDonald, a character who became the king of the Chicago underworld. In his youth, the boy saw the humiliations his family had to endure. Spitting, contempt, pogroms, pennies for the honest labor of a shoemaker. This was not the life they dreamed of. But the boy did not waste his time. Constantly running through the streets, he quickly figured out where the city's prosperous gambling houses operated, where people were losing hundreds, if not thousands, of bucks. And back then, the dollar was worth completely different money. When he turned 18, he immersed himself in the industry headfirst, wandering through gambling houses, talking with the owners, in short, studying the entire ins and outs of the market. There he realized that in reality, no matter how talented you were, you wouldn't earn much. To get rich, you need to control the entire business process. But Mike decided to build his empire in Chicago. Why there, and not in the South? In the 19th century, it seemed like a real dump. The population was 3 times smaller than in Philadelphia. The infrastructure was rubbish. But Mike saw an untouched gem in Chicago. Unlike the East Coast, there were no Irish there, which meant there was no bad attitude towards them either. Besides, the city itself had not yet been built up. Irish migrants, along with the locals, were creating the fastest-growing city in America out of a backwater. And the Irish there were considered full-fledged Americans. As a bonus, criminal gangs had not yet taken root in the city. No, underground clubs were already operating. The streets were full of small gangs of bandits, but for now, it was chaos. Unsystematic, wild, unpredictable, and most importantly, it didn't bring in real money. Michael McDonald decided he could change that. He started small again, establishing connections with local gangs, studying how the shadow business worked. But now Mike also befriended local officials. This became the trump card of the future card magnate. He played it for the first time in the Civil War. The Northerners had set up recruitment centers in all their states. Any adult citizen could show up there, receive a salary, and go off with a rifle in hand to fight the Confederates. The Irish often went there. Between 150,000 and 200,000 of them joined the Union Army. But only one Irishman figured out how to really make money from the war, our clever Mike. He came up with a scheme that can be conditionally called the Disappearing Act. Watch closely. Mike helps recruitment centers find new military force. He brings a certain Paddy MacGuffin to them and shows him the way to the recruitment point. Then, through Mike, a certain Paul is registered with the Union Army. He is followed by James, Kevin, Connor, Andrew. Mike helps all of them join the army out of his kind, broad Irish heart. For this, of course, he takes his percentage. One might ask, so, where's the trick? Just the usual work of a recruiter. Nothing criminal. The trick is that all these Paddys, Pauls, Kevins, and Andrews, all these soldiers, are one and the same person. Mike ran the same person through the same recruitment centers, received the salary, absconded, and then came back for it again. How did he not get caught with such a carousel? A counter-question, and how were you going to do that? In the 19th century, there were no digital catalogs, nor any remotely coherent databases. The documents that the recruits showed didn't even have photographs. The entire business scheme was based on the center's employees not recognizing the newcomer as the Paddy who had received his salary a week ago and run away. Just in case, to cover his tracks, Mike brought in the officials with whom he had been friends for years. This story revealed 2 main credos of Mike's game. First, reliance on connections. Finding the right person is sometimes much more useful than another shop from which you'll shake down money. McDonald was not a brute by nature, like his New York colleagues. He was a spider who wove officials, big money, and new connections into his web. Mike's spider-like nature was also evident in his second principle, minimal involvement. He no longer ran around on his own 2 feet looking for trouble. Mike built a precise clockwork mechanism, where everyone was in their place and performed their strictly assigned function. The deserter recruitment scheme was a trial run. Then Mike hired his own recruiters and took a percentage from their commission. He then complicated the structure so much that he created a whole network of front men and intermediaries. Some forged documents, others processed army clerks, and a third group trained recruits on how to escape from camps before being sent to the front. When the business started bringing in big money, he decided to scale it nationwide. Now Mike worked not only in Chicago but in other cities as well. For McDonald, the war was like a dear mother. We don't have exact data on how much he ripped off the U.S. Army. McDonald was no fool, so he didn't go trumpeting about it to everyone he met. But we can at least estimate the amount. Look, the Northerners paid differently for one recruit. It all depended on the region and the situation at the front. The range was from $100 to $1,000 of that time. In Chicago and the nearby regions, the scale was smaller. On average, the recruitment of one person was valued at 5 of these bills, with the formidable eagle, a symbol of free America. In today's money, one recruit could cost the treasury hundreds of thousands of rubles. Of course, a significant part of the money went to bribes, payment for the services of intermediaries, and other personnel, but MacDonald would not have become the master of Chicago if he were engaged in unprofitable business. And he handled this money carefully. Unlike the Irish of New York, MacDonald did not spend money on drink, women, and flashy outfits. He invested the capital earned through such labor into what would bring him millions: the gambling business. The gambling houses of Chicago in those years had neither a systematic approach nor a financial plan. At most, they had primitive cheating schemes on which you couldn't earn much. Underground casinos at that time went broke no less often than their visitors. MacDonald did not see himself in the same boat with these losers. The main feature of his establishment was that people were not cheated there. Well, during the game itself, Mike did not interfere with the natural order of things. It wasn't for him to decide who should get lucky. But on those whom fortune turned away from, he took his revenge with a vengeance. Judge for yourself. If a gambling addict comes to an establishment, sooner or later he will definitely lose all his money. When that happens, the poor guy will surely think, well, if I had just a little more money, I would definitely win it back. And at that moment, what luck, a businesslike gentleman approaches him and offers a small loan. As one would understand, the players went home not just without money, but up to their ears in these microloans. The moneylender who approached the poor fellow is not a random person, but another gear in MacDonald's mechanism. At the Irishman's casino, you either simply lost everything, or you became his debtor. A win-win strategy. His debtors included not only blue-collar workers, but also judges, officials, and policemen. All the right people in Chicago sooner or later ended up in Mike's debt book, but this was not enough for him. He understood that influential debtors could get angry, unite, and wipe him off the face of the city. He needed status. Armor that would make Mike invincible. That armor became the store. MacDonald opened the main citadel of his empire in 1873 on the corner of Clark and Monroe Streets. A 4-story complex that had everything: a luxurious casino, a first-class hotel, a bar, and a restaurant. The store was the largest gambling center in Chicago. If the main characters of Todd Phillips' famous film had lived in the late 19th century, they would have celebrated their bachelor party not in Vegas, which was then a village in the desert, but in Chicago. For Mike, the store became a springboard into the big leagues. The king of Chicago's gambling house attracted the elite from various echelons, from politicians and businessmen to criminal bosses. The Irishman became a real matchmaker for the upper echelons of the state of Illinois. Major business deals, tense negotiations, political agreements, everything went through MacDonald. By that year in Chicago, the phrase, "Go see Mike," had become a catchphrase among all the city's officials and criminals. Need to get someone out of jail, influence a judge, pass a city ordinance. Go see Mike. The Irishman placed his main bet on politicians in his work. He personally did not participate in elections, of course, that was not his style. Mike played differently. He sponsored the figures he needed, who then defended his interests and, for example, did not shut down his not-so-legal establishment, the store. MacDonald didn't forget about journalists either. He invested tens of thousands of dollars in the then-popular newspaper, The Globe. The investments paid off. The Irishman managed to overthrow the Republicans, who were constantly putting spokes in his wheels. But even for such a giant of criminal thought, the father of Chicago democracy, not everything was possible. MacDonald was let down by a sense of impunity. He constantly stole from the city budget. And with each year, he did it more brazenly. In '87, he was caught in an uncharacteristically primitive scheme for him. That's what overconfidence leads to. Through his firm, he tried to successfully embezzle a round sum for the repair of the courthouse. The press, which MacDonald hadn't paid off completely, uncovered the scheme. This was the first blow to the Irishman. But the real trouble came from where he least expected it, from the woman he loved. In August of '89, Mike's wife ran away from him to Paris with a Catholic priest whom the Irishman had hired for his beloved as a spiritual mentor. The family drama hit him hard. His own associates realized this and decided they had grown fangs sharp enough to bite the boss's hand. For example, the city's mayor, whom the Irishman himself had brought to power, an already elderly politician, decided that he could move forward without the support of the city's shadow king. Soon, the mayor was found with a bullet in his head at his home. The official version, a political opponent went mad and shot the mayor in broad daylight. But the whole city understood that the Irishman was behind it. Jupiter was angry, which meant he was losing control. And then MacDonald made his second fatal mistake. He married a former classmate of his son's. She was 25 at the time. This marriage became another trial. The girl could regularly, publicly scold and mock him. She could beat him in public, him, the chief criminal boss of Chicago. And she cheated on her beloved husband with a 15-year-old schoolboy. And then another plot twist. She found out that this schoolboy was also cheating on her. The Irishman's wife couldn't take it and, during another argument, killed her own lover, and with him, her husband's reputation. Lawsuits, his wife's prison sentence, ridicule in the press, all of this crushed the 68-year-old king of Chicago. On August 9, 1907, his heart, shattered to pieces, stopped. Immediately, the Irishman's empire began to crumble. His heirs could not peacefully divide what they had inherited. The showdown spilled onto the streets of Chicago. For almost 20 years, the gunshots and smoke from fires did not cease in the Windy City. The residents of Chicago would remember these years as the gambling wars. Now, imagine oneself in the place of an ordinary resident of the city in, say, 1916. One reads in the newspapers about the terrible war in Europe. Thousands of soldiers are dying under shelling and bombs, suffocating in trenches from poisonous gases. And at the same time, one has a chaotic frenzy happening right outside their window. A real urban war is going on in the street. The city hall is not just failing to cope, it is thoroughly corrupt and also participating in this slaughter. Outraged crowds of citizens took to the streets of Chicago. The city that was once free from xenophobia came to hate the Irish. Ironically, in fleeing condemnation and criminal wars, the Irish brought both to Chicago. As is customary, the Protestants protested. Deeply religious and enraged residents of Chicago insisted, all these criminal wars are because the people have given themselves over to sin. The media began to write more and more often that gambling and alcohol are the scourge of the American nation, so they must be banned as quickly as possible. The protests, triggered by the showdowns of Irish gangs in Chicago, launched a new era in the criminal history of America, the era of Prohibition. Prohibition gave the Irish a chance they had missed half a century earlier. The 1920s began triumphantly for them. Irish bootleggers were the first to seize the opportunity, building supply chains, and getting the police and local officials under their thumb. What kind of Irishmen are they if they can't make money on their favorite liquor? There are two reasons for this success. Firstly, the Irish still dominated the criminal underworld of the states. Secondly, and more importantly, the gangs themselves had changed. The Irish slowly began to move away from their clan-based model in favor of classic criminal corporations. Thanks to Uncle MacDonald and the melting pot of New York, which effectively combated xenophobia. One problem, quick success went to their heads. If they had been more observant, they would have noticed that these heads were already spinning on the chopping block. The success of their competitors, the Italians, has been discussed more than once. The Italian Mafia for a long time worked in the shadow of their red-bearded comrades, but they were not idle in this shadow. Take the same 5 Points gang again. The future kings of the criminal world, Lucky Luciano, the godfather of Vegas Bugsy Siegel, Al Capone, they all went through this gang. The Italians and Jews knew well how the Irish did business. They understood their habits and customs. They watched, adopted, and learned for years. The Irish eventually relaxed, and this played a cruel joke on them. In the new, more complex structure of the black economy, the Irish were completely unsuccessful. Coordination between gangs was weak. Connections with suppliers and the police were unreliable. This is what the Italians pressed on. The war began unexpectedly. In New York, the Italians decided not to get their hands dirty and controlled politicians and police on the Irish. The underground empire of the Irish collapsed. Ships that transported alcohol from Canada were turned back before they even entered the port. Then the Italians began to saw at the already weak ropes that connected the different groups, and they started to bribe some to set them against others. The national Irish sport. As a result, The heads of the gangs either rotted in prison or in the ground. Their henchmen scattered, most often under the wing of the Italians. The story of the Chicago Irish ended with more bloodshed. Al Capone took on the city that once belonged to McDonald. He entered the bootlegging market without knocking. The first thing he did was eliminate his main competitor, an Irishman named Dean O'Banion. In November 1924, 2 armed Italians burst into Dean's flower shop. They caught O'Banion off guard. The killers worked precisely and cold-bloodedly. 2 bullets to the chest, 2 bullets to the neck. Capone showed special care for the heirs of Mike McDonald. He sent heavily armed mercenaries to them, who shot almost the entire top brass of the Irish gang. Those who survived fled the city and never resurfaced for the rest of their lives. The Irish missed the chance that Prohibition had given them. New York was lost. Chicago was taken over by new, effective, angry, and resourceful players. Not a trace was left of McDonald's empire and the dead rabbits. And that's all. The Irish succeed not because of, but in spite of. And then, a man appears in this story who was able to revive what seemed destined never to be revived again. With his cruelty on the one hand, and his calculating mind on the other, this player turned the entire criminal world of the New World upside down. This is the story of Whitey Bulger. Whitey is the son of that same Irish youth who lost his arm and left New York in search of a better life. The young man then headed northeast, moved to the state of Massachusetts, and settled in Boston. At that time, thousands of Irish were heading there, and it's clear why. It was the 1930s, the height of the Great Depression. Millions of workers, and Irish migrants were mostly proletarians, were left without jobs and money. There was nothing to live on, nothing to lose. And in the South Boston neighborhood, a program for building public housing for the poor had just started. The Bulger family, along with hundreds of other Irish families, settled in one such housing project in the south of the city. Another reason the Bulgars went specifically to Boston was that the city had been a center for American Irish since time immemorial. Chicago also maintained ties with the community, despite the defeat of its gangs. This is what the city looks like during the celebration of St. Patrick's Day. The river that cuts through downtown Chicago is dyed green annually. But Boston, of course, is a much more Irish place. It is known that the Celts took a liking to it at least since the 15th century. It's a port city. From Ireland, it's literally a month-and-a-half journey on a coffin ship in good weather. For many refugees, Boston was just a transit point to get to New York, but many settled there permanently. As a result, by the mid-19th century, 35,000 Irish lived here. By today's standards, that's not a lot, but back then it was a quarter of the entire city. That is why Boston seems to many to be the most European of American cities. The Irish settled in and created an environment around them that they were used to on their green island. The Irish influence in Boston is so strong that the city developed its own accent. Here's how Louis C.K., a legendary comedian with Irish roots who himself grew up in Boston, mocks it. People say it's a Boston accent, but it's not an accent. It's a whole city of people who pronounce most words incorrectly. My teacher's name was Miss Doherty, but she thought her last name was pronounced Doherty. As a result, Boston became the city where the Irish heritage has been preserved more than anywhere else in the States. Even the symbolism of the Boston Celtics, the local team that became the NBA champion last season, simultaneously refers to the Celts, leprechauns, and the shamrock. These are all national symbols of Ireland. And it was in this vibrant green environment that Whitey Bulger lived. He loved football, attended parochial school, but scraped by with C's and D's. He wasn't interested in his studies, unlike what was happening on the streets. If one has managed to picture Bulger as a typical Irish thug from a poor family, they are right, but only partly. On the one hand, he regularly beat up the neighborhood kids, lifted weights at home, and then went wandering around the area. On the other hand, in the eyes of adults, he was a real son of your mother's friend. He always said hello, helped carry groceries, and generally behaved very gallantly. This dualism of a hardened thug and a European gentleman would become his signature in his criminal career as well. It is not known exactly when he got into it. But by the age of 14, he was caught stealing from freight trucks. The cops arrested him and, during the interrogation, beat him half to death. The guy recalled that they broke his arm and stuck a gun in his mouth. But Whitey didn't rat on his own. The story ended for him in a juvenile detention colony. In '48, it became clear that Whitey wouldn't finish school. He enlists in the U.S. Air Force, but things don't work out for him there either. Constant fights and insubordination ended with another prison term for him, only this time in a military one. His military education, like his school one, didn't work out, and in '52 he was discharged from the Air Force. The fate of the gallant hooligan Whitey Bulger was sealed. It was then that Whitey plunged headfirst into crime. His first haven was the Shamrocks Gang, a neighborhood gang of Irish Americans from South Boston, with whom Bulger had played football since childhood. The hooligan helped them with small things. Stealing a car here, participating in a mugging there. Nothing out of the ordinary. One might be wondering now, where did Irish gangsters come from in Boston in the mid-20th century? Let's not forget that in those years, the Great Depression had been over for several decades. Post-war America, well, after a couple of years of recession, was rolling in money. Economic prosperity reached the perennially deprived Irish. Their traditionally blue collars were rapidly turning white. They moved into offices and decent homes. What's more, they already had a whole John F. Kennedy. His great-grandfather was an Irish immigrant. And unlike other presidents who also had Irish ancestors, he was very proud of his roots and, when he became president, brought many functionaries with Irish roots onto his team. So where did gangs like the Shamrocks come from? It so happened that the rise in the standard of living for the Irish, along with the rest of the country, passed by the South Boston neighborhood. It was an economically depressed place, a real hole, and as a result, high unemployment, ethnic isolation, and other social joys. And this played into the hands of the hapless Whitey. After messing around with the football players, he moved up a level and started robbing banks. It's funny that even in this dubious line of work, Bulger maintained his usual gallantry. A woman who personally witnessed a bank robbery in Rutland, which is south of Boston, literally an hour's drive away, said that Whitey spoke to her using all the clichés from gangster movies. He praised the appearance of the bank branch and, looking her straight in the eye, said, "Lady, I will not harm you." He just stopped short of kissing her hand. In just 6 months, the bank robberies brought this thug's gang $1.2 million in modern-day dollars. And also a court sentence, 20 years in federal prison. And he spent this time productively. In the first 2 years of his sentence, Whitey spent a month and a half in solitary confinement for fighting. Then Bulger realized that he should try to shorten his sentence, not extend it with such antics. And so he signed up for the infamous MKUltra, a secret CIA program where real experiments were conducted on participants. The CIA was trying to create the perfect truth serum, tools for recruitment and mind control. Decades later, everything would be revealed and the security forces would be condemned for abusing people. But that was no comfort to Bulger at the time. For each month of participation in the experiment, his sentence was reduced by 3 days. In the end, Bulger was pumped with substances for, listen to this, 18 consecutive months. He would later write in his diaries that it was a real nightmare and the experiment plunged him into the depths of madness. For the rest of his life, he suffered from nightmares, heard voices in his head, and feared that the CIA would deal with him if he told anyone about the experiment. After participating in the MKUltra program, Whitey was transferred to Alcatraz. And this prison, one of the most famous in the world, became a resort for him. There, a thirst for knowledge unexpectedly awoke in him. He completed all the correspondence courses he could get his hands on, accounting, business, typing. Bulger buried himself in books on history and political philosophy. He was particularly taken with the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince and the Art of War. Perhaps a major analysis of this Florentine philosopher and the politicians he influenced, directly or indirectly, will be done someday. For now, let's highlight the main thing that Bulger took away for himself. It's not a fact, by the way, that Machiavelli wrote it this way. What's important is that Whitey interpreted it this way for himself. First, the end justifies the means. Second, a successful leader must manipulate people. And third, powerful people are obligated to spit on morality and ethics. Whitey dedicated the rest of his time to sports and maintaining his reputation as a courteous gentleman. While in prison, he even received an honorary certificate for helping patients in physical therapy, for his teamwork skills, and, note this, his cheerful character. The reputation worked as intended. After 9 years, Bulger is released on parole and returns to South Boston, traumatized, well-read, and very dangerous. At first, his family tries to help him get his life back on track. His politician brother gets him a job as a cleaner at the local courthouse. But Whitey Bulger had his own plans. He joined the most influential gang in South Boston and quickly became its main weapon. And this was actually a big problem. It was already the 70s. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. Demobilized soldiers were returning to the U.S. en masse. From episodes on biker gangs, it's known that out of desperation, veterans who were not accepted by society often formed gangs. The Irish, they also fought and also returned from Vietnam, were no exception. In South Boston, which was thoroughly Irish, they formed their own organized crime group, and soon a war broke out between them and Bulger's gang. It claimed the lives of about 20 people. Whitey personally killed at least one of them. But here's the problem. During the war, Bulger's gang lost its influence. Soon, Boston was taken over by a new gang, the Winter Hill Gang. While the smaller organized crime groups traditionally engaged in petty crime and killed each other, Winter Hill mastered the niche of illegal gambling and made it to the big leagues. These gangsters didn't like the state of affairs in Boston at all. They wanted to stop the war. The Veterans Gang quickly came under the wing of the Winter Hill Gang and was ready to crush Bulger's crew, which wanted independence. It was then that Whitey made his first decisive move. Bypassing his leadership, he went to secret negotiations with Winter Hill and the veterans, after which he came to a meeting with his boss and said, "It's over. You're out. No more warnings." And so, Bulger became the newly minted head of the gang under the protection of the largest organized crime group in Boston. He soared very high, but he didn't stop there. Whitey managed to convince the bosses of Winter Hill to start internal purges. Heads immediately began to roll in the gang. The bodies of the main functionaries of the gang began to be found all over Boston. The big bosses were rooting out any disloyalty in their inner circle, but they didn't understand that they were actually dancing to the tune of this insolent Irishman. Whitey started, naturally, with the veterans. They were still angry at him for the murder during the war and wanted revenge. The body of the cell's boss was found buried on one of Boston's beaches. That's what you get for playing games involving burying people in the sand. Bulger began to be feared. If anyone so much as looked at him sideways, that person became a walking corpse. Just to give you an idea of the man's scale. Once in a bar, a gang member was talking to Whitey. And during the conversation, he clenched his fist aggressively. He noticed. A week later, the gangster, who was deemed too insolent and rude, was killed. Bulger skillfully turned the paranoia of the Winter Hill bosses to his advantage. The threat passed, but trouble still snuck up. The feds came down on the gang. The accomplices began to be put away like potatoes for racketeering, fraud, and illegal bookmaking. But no one touched Whitey. Although understanding that he was one of the main players in this scheme is not a difficult task. Why is that? All these years, the Irishman had been cooperating with the FBI. From the point of view of any Irish gangster, this is a mortal sin. To them, snitches are worse than rapists. But Whitey Bulger wouldn't be himself if he didn't break all the rules many times over. Let's rewind a bit. In the 40s, when Whitey was in his 20s and was still just a prominent hooligan in his neighborhood, he met a boy named John Connolly in a local store. Bulger bought the little boy an ice cream. One thing led to another, and they became friends. The gallant hooligan protected him from older boys and taught him a thing or two. So, 30 years pass, it's the 70s. Bulger, as we know, is one of the main gangsters in Boston, and little John Connolly, in those 30 years, has become a special agent in the FBI. As one would imagine, the Irishman kept such a friend as close as possible. The main headache for the FBI in those years was the Italian Cosa Nostra. Connolly, who wanted to make a quick career for himself, remembered his childhood friend. He told Whitey that the Cosa Nostra wanted to take him out, so it was in his best interest to become an informant. He knew that Bulger had enough knowledge and connections to sell out the leaders of the Cosa Nostra completely. Bulger agrees to work, but makes Connolly a counteroffer. "I'll leak you info from the criminal world, and you leak me info from the world of the feds. You'll warn me about wiretaps, raids, and cover for me where necessary. I'll pay well." The childhood friends shook hands. First, Whitey sold out the Italians, and then his own bosses. They were imprisoned for organizing illegal horse races, and Whitey Bulger took control of the gang himself. With a light movement of his unscrupulous hand, the Irishman got rid of both external and internal competition. The Winter Hill Gang and Bulger personally began to live their best life. Not without difficulties. In the 80s, the states began to legalize the gambling business en masse. For this, a state lottery was launched in the USA. It began to eat away at the main asset of the criminal gambling business, hopeless gambling addicts. No problem, thought Bulger, and realized that instead of the gray area of gambling, he needed to develop the black, but eternally green, niche. That niche became illegal substances. The Winter Hill Gang began to provide protection for drug dealers. If you dared to sell without kicking back a percentage to Uncle Whitey, you'd be caught, your teeth would be pulled out so the body couldn't be identified, and you'd be buried on the Atlantic shore. The ocean is just a stone's throw away. As we know today, from racketeering alone, Bulger earned $25 million in his career. How much money he made from trafficking can only be guessed. After the Boston hooligan took over as the boss, the Winter Hill Gang began to conduct its business more organizedly. It should be noted here, despite the high stakes, the gang still operated quite chaotically. There was no clear structure or hierarchy. Although Whitey did not manage to turn Winter Hill into some kind of corporation or at least a Mexican cartel, this organized crime group worked very centrally. For example, they got their own auto service, which served as the main headquarters and, at the same time, a legal cover for their dark deeds. It needs to be emphasized here that everything in the gang revolved around the figure of Bulger. Here's why in the Italian Mafia, gangsters respected the Don. The logic is this: I serve the Don not only because my father served him, but also because he is a sensible man and knows what he is doing. This, if we recall the theory of the sociologist Weber, is a traditional and rational legal type of political domination. The Irish had a slightly different system. In their gangs, the boss had to have a personal, exceptional charisma. An Irish boss had to be not only fearsome, effective, and respected, but also, if necessary, be able to drink more beer than the others and smash the face of any offender. Remember Michael Corleone, a fictional but no less realistic character. A person like him could not have become the head of an Irish gang. I mean, Michael is kind of lost, nervous, his wife is practically cheating on him. But in Winter Hill, absolutely everything was built on the charisma of its leader, Mr. Bulger. Even when he became a multimillionaire, he personally went on showdowns and took people out with his own fists. This strong image kept the Winter Hill Gang in line. But the Irishman was playing with fire, because the only condition his FBI handlers had set for him was not to kill anyone. Once, Whitey's own associates wanted to sell him out. In '82, a rank-and-file member of the gang was suspected of murder, and he decided to trade information about Bulger's dark deeds for his freedom. That was a mistake. Connolly, the gallant hooligan's friend from the FBI, immediately told Whitey that he was being sold out. A couple of months later, he personally shot up the car with a carbine where his former colleague and his completely uninvolved friend were sitting. Both died. It's understandable where Bulger's love for violence came from. It was their charismatic type of management, and his personal traumas. The consequences of MKUltra had not disappeared. He continued to suffer from hallucinations and nightmares, so cruel that you wouldn't wish them on your worst enemy. There was a legend that the Irishman's personal psychiatrist was forced to give up his patient because he could not bear the retellings of his bloody fantasies. There are problems with charismatic leadership here too, which sociologist Weber simply did not live to see. In the second half of the 20th century, it often revolved not around charisma, but around pseudo-charisma, when it is much more rational and mediated, non-radical, media-oriented, rather than supernatural. There were so many regulations and institutions in society that old-school charismatics are simply not born anymore. As is often the case, big politics ruined the gangster. The boss of Winter Hill was very fond of the Irish Republican Army, the very same IRA. It fought for the freedom of Northern Ireland. The rest of Ireland had already managed to gain independence from Britain in 1920, but the northern part of the island still remained under the Crown. South Boston, in this conflict, naturally, rooted for its own, and Bulger was perhaps the biggest fan of the IRA. Even when he was a petty gangster, he was already donating to them, and when he became the city's top criminal, he realized that he could now provide support directly. He got to know the army commanders and began to ship them rifles and explosives across the ocean. And the radicals actively used Bulger's packages in hundreds of terrorist attacks in London and throughout Britain. Everything was going smoothly until one of the arms shipments was uncovered by the police. One of the crew members later confessed that he was working with Winter Hill. Thanks to his friend in the FBI, Bulger quickly figured out who the traitor was. The snitch was buried right in the basement of Whitey's house. But this was already the beginning of the end. Clouds were gathering over Boston's top gangster. A bloody trail of dozens of murders followed Whitey. Then, very inconveniently, John Connolly decided to leave the FBI. This was already 1990. The special agent was honorably discharged, and he only managed to warn his old friend, "They're digging up dirt on you." Until '94, Bulger maintained control over the criminal underworld of Boston. But in December, Connolly found out that the U.S. Department of Justice was preparing charges against him. The boss of Winter Hill was supposed to be arrested on Christmas. Whitey went on the run. Law enforcement agencies came down on Bulger's closest associates. At first, they held their ground, but when they found out how many years their boss had been cooperating with the authorities, they made a deal. For information alone that would help catch Whitey, there was a reward of $2 million. At that time, only Osama bin Laden had a higher price on his head. How long do you think the average American gangster spends on the run? A month, a year. A gangster from the list of America's 10 most wanted people, 16.5 years. This Machiavellian gangster had everything figured out. A couple of years before his escape, Bulger took to traveling. Like the Wolf of Wall Street, he traveled all over Europe with an accomplice, but for completely non-touristic purposes. He was creating a new identity for himself, a man named Thomas Baxter, with all the passports and credit cards. As a bonus, he hid safes with cash, jewelry, and passports in various locations in the USA, Canada, Ireland, Britain, and Italy. Therefore, when Whitey went on the run, he didn't have to hide in back alleys like Pablo Escobar. He traveled the world peacefully, confident in his future. He was spotted everywhere, in Uruguay, at a movie screening in London, in bookstores in Canada, on the Santa Monica Pier in California. An accomplice, who managed to cross paths with Bulger during those 16 years, wrote in his memoirs, "I don't think they'll ever catch him. If he has a gun with him, he'd rather go out in a blaze of glory than spend the rest of his life in prison." But the moment of glory never came. In 2011, the 81-year-old Whitey Bulger was lured out of his Santa Monica apartment by a ruse. By that time, his dear friend and accomplice John Connolly had already been in prison for 6 years. It turned out that he had received $250,000 in bribes from his senior associate and had committed a contract killing for him. The former FBI officer, by the way, is still alive. He is 84. He was recently released from prison for health reasons. The fate of Whitey Bulger turned out differently. He was found guilty of 11 murders, racketeering, and possession of firearms. The result? 2 life sentences plus 5 years for good measure. In his final years, Bulger was actively losing his mind, sexually harassing prison staff and threatening to kill them. His final resting place was a prison in West Virginia in 2018. The local inmates knew in advance what a big star and what a big snitch was coming to them. Upon his arrival, the 89-year-old Whitey was beaten to death. So badly that his corpse was almost unrecognizable. Based on this story, though before Bulger's tragic death, Martin Scorsese managed to shoot another film for the ages. The Departed. However, in the film, everything ends differently than in life. And there was certainly nothing in it about who would become Bulger's heir in Europe. The Irish gangs of the past. That's it, an era has passed. Organized crime groups in the format of the Dead Rabbits and the Winter Hill Gang outlived themselves and were crushed. Do you remember how their story began? Mass migration, discrimination. The Irish got stuck in a marginal lifestyle and couldn't get out. At the end of the 19th century, the situation began to change, albeit with great difficulty. During the Civil War, they proved that they had no less right to be called Americans than other migrants. Political structures like Tammany Hall mercilessly exploited the Irish, but for many, this social lift raised them very high, into public service, business, politics, like the Kennedy clan. And if you compare the Irish with other diasporas, they had a much greater chance of assimilation. They all knew the English language. Their skin was white. Yes, they were Catholics, but still Christians. In the end, the Irish became an example of perhaps the most successful assimilation in U.S. history. Nearly 10% of the U.S. population, which is 32 million people, has Irish roots. The religious divide has also faded away. Through the efforts of Irish and Italian migrants, today every fifth American peacefully practices Catholicism. Economic discrimination is also a thing of the past. On the contrary, the average American of Irish descent earns $79,000 a year, $5,000 more than the median resident of the States. In the end, the Irish gangs of America, which were formed as a response to discrimination and social disadvantage, lost not only to other organized crime groups but also to economic growth and assimilation, which, let's be honest, is not so bad. As for Ireland itself, which had been independent for many years by that time, an economic miracle happened in the country 30 to 40 years ago. The government lowered taxes, attracted billions in investments, and by the 2000s, the unemployment rate had fallen fourfold, from 20% to 5%. GDP grew at a rate of 9.4% per year. This is the level of China during its economic miracle. One of the poorest countries in Europe was rapidly becoming one of the richest. However, economic growth did not affect everyone. In the 2000s, about 10% of the population lived below the poverty line. And these were the most vulnerable groups, the elderly and the youth. They lived, moreover, not on the outskirts, but in the centers of large cities. The districts of Dublin, for example, were dotted with social housing for the poor. Young men from disadvantaged families watched the wealthy life they could not afford from their bedroom windows. This is how the main Irish organized crime group of our days appeared. The Kinahans, named after its founder, Christy Kinahan. Initially, Christy was a kind of villain from Scooby-Doo. As soon as he set up some criminal scheme, car theft, check forgery, or drug trafficking, he was quickly packed up and sent to prison. Kinahan didn't stay there long, got out again, and went back to his old ways. Over his career, he was arrested 5 times and imprisoned 3 times. In total, he served more than 10 years. In the 90s, Kinahan realized that sitting in prison was kind of boring. Then he began to remake himself in the image of Whitey Bulger. In prison, he earned 2 academic degrees, learned several languages, and established a large network of contacts. From prison, he flew straight to Amsterdam to start building his drug empire there. The capital of the Netherlands had all the conditions for this. The decriminalization of some drugs did not kill, but spurred the demand for hard substances. You couldn't get that kind of stuff in legal shops. But the underground dealers felt that their client base was only growing. This is the niche that Kinahan occupied. He became the main drug wholesaler in Amsterdam. Looking at Bulger, whose empire collapsed at the snap of law enforcement's fingers, Kinahan understood that you can't put all your eggs in one basket. While the traffic was going by ships from the Netherlands to Ireland, his sons recruited gangs all over Dublin. After that, the Kinahan network spread throughout Britain and Spain. But judge for yourself, running such a dangerous business in several European countries at once on your own is an absolutely impossible task. Therefore, the Kinahans rose above their ego and began to cooperate with other organized crime groups, which handled distribution for them. The Irish organized crime group turned into an international supercartel. They build distribution relationships with Balkan organized crime groups, with Italian families, with gangs in Britain, the Chinese Mafia, and even with the Hells Angels motorcycle club. The scheme is the same everywhere. The Kinahans order substances from Colombia and Mexico. They are delivered to Europe in containers, then port employees are bribed so there are no problems at reception, and all this stuff is distributed to local distributors. The profits are laundered either through the gambling business or through endless businesses in Dubai. It is there, according to the police, that the leaders of the Kinahan clan are hiding today, including Christy himself. He is already 68 years old. It is estimated that the capitalization of the Kinahan family today is at least $1 billion. The new generation of Celtic gangs has caught up with and surpassed their ancestors. However, what is even more important is that the trail of Irish gangs is present not only in the drug market but also in professional sports. One of the legitimate enterprises of Kinahan's eldest son was his own fighting promotion, MTK Global. There, one of the biggest gangsters of modern times managed to work with the legendary Tyson Fury. Here they are in a photo together. Kinahan managed to organize a Fury versus Anthony Joshua fight. And everyone was happy with it. However, when it turned out who owned the company, the USA banned Fury from entering the country. But the Kinahans managed to establish even stronger ties with Conor McGregor. Conor is from Dublin, and he grew up and lived literally next door to this family. And when his own sister Aoife started dating a convicted drug trafficker from the cartel, it became clear that they walked the same paths. Conor occasionally appears in joint photos with the gangsters, and they come to his pub to have a beer. Journalists created a huge scandal out of these connections. Articles were published claiming that McGregor himself was practically a participant in criminal schemes. In Ireland, the topic of organized crime is a sensitive and often discussed one. But if you look at the dry numbers, the country is becoming calmer. The number of violent crimes is decreasing by several percent annually. Today, Celtic gangs have dissolved into global criminal networks just as skillfully as the Irish diaspora in the USA. They are no longer drunken thugs, but cruel and cynical professionals who outsmart the American DEA and the international Interpol. The story of the Irish gangs is a saga of a people who were driven from their homeland, humiliated in emigration, and seem to have forgotten what a peaceful life is. The Irish came to the New World as victims, but very quickly became a threat to it. They learned to use chaos to their advantage. Discrimination and humiliation became the fuel for their self-organization, but the clan structure in the new conditions so far has not become a monolith. Irish gangs are a product of cultural trauma and eternal exile. Their history is a constant pendulum swing between the fight for justice and self-destruction. And the latter, as can already be seen, has won.